Welcome to Role-Playing History, the podcast where we explore the history of role-playing games. I'm Wayne Davis, and I'll be your tour guide for today's show. Episode 6, Avalon Hill and Judges Guild. The past 2 weeks, we've been covering the timeline of role-playing games from their creation through the mid-1980s. Today, though, we're taking a break from timelines to dive a little deeper into the history of two game companies that have had a big impact on the industry, Avalon Hill and Judges Guild. Avalon Hill started up in 1952 just outside of Baltimore, Maryland, in a town called Catonsville. Charles S. Roberts founded the company under the name The Avalon Game Company so that he could publish his game called Tactics. Tactics was a war game, and it was a pioneer in the industry, with things such as odds ratio combat result tables, variable movement costs for entering squares, and evolving the use of cardboard counters, which had originally been introduced in 1911. Another thing that made Tactics different is that it was specifically designed for the mass market, in that everything you needed was included in the box: printed map, pieces, rules, and the box itself. Other games at this point either were not designed for the mass market or they used miniatures with self-made maps or terrain. So, Tactics was a very successful game for Roberts, so much so that he released a second version of the game in 1958. That version, however, had a new publisher name on it, as Roberts had changed the name of the company to Avalon Hill in order to avoid conflict with another company using a similar name. Little piece of trivia here: Roberts settled on Avalon Hill because the house he lived in the Avalon neighborhood of Catonsville, was actually located on a hill. There you go. 1958 saw Avalon Hill release two more games: Gettysburg, which was another war game based on, you get it, the Civil War Battle of Gettysburg, and a railroad game called Dispatcher. In 1959, Avalon Hill got a real office as Roberts moved the company into an office space on Gay Street in Baltimore. That same year, Avalon Hill released the first game designed by an outside source, Verdict, which was designed by corporate lawyers Tom Nissel and Ray Thiem. Verdict was a board game for 2 players, with the object of the game being to be the first lawyer to get 4 jurors into the jury box. Also, one of the players is the prosecutor, while the other is defense counsel. The game came with 15 different criminal cases, which meant the game came with 15 different complete games. Verdict has been out of print for quite some time now, but used copies can be found online from prices ranging anywhere from $35 to $125 US. Something that needs to be noted at this point, because it'll be a big deal in a few moments, is that Avalon Hill didn't have a set number of game releases for a year from 1958 through 1964. In fact, the release number was anywhere from 1 to 7 games, depending on the year. In 1960, Avalon Hill moved offices yet again and hired an employee, Thomas N. Shaw, who happened to be a high school friend of Roberts. Shaw was brought on board specifically to design new games. Shaw's appointment paid dividends immediately, as Avalon Hill published the first mostly diceless sports game in 1960, called Football Strategy. It was followed quickly by Baseball Strategy and Basketball Strategy. It should be noted that Shaw had published Football Strategy initially on his own through his own company, Strategy Game Company, prior to his employment with Avalon Hill. Once he joined Avalon, he brought his games on board. In 1961, racing got a version of strategy games, Le Mans. Based on the race of the same name, players were racing against one another to win the classic car race. I was able to find recollections from players of this game online, and most of the people who played it loved it. In fact, I read several recollections from players who took the game a step further, creating maps of all the racetracks on the various circuits in order to play with their friends. 1961 also brought an issue for Avalon Hill. The United States began to experience a bit of a recession, and that brought with it a drop in sales. And that brought with it an increase in debts for the company. I need you to remember that, because all of this comes back around in another minute or so. In 1963, Avalon Hill created a children's line, releasing 4 games: Imagination, What Time Is It?, Dollhouse, and Trucks, Trains, Boats, and Planes. Every single one of them flopped, and it sunk the line. Because of this, Roberts decided he'd had enough. His plan was to file for bankruptcy on December 13th, 1963. And that should have been the end of Avalon Hill. However, Roberts' creditors had a different idea. Monarch Office Services and J.E. Smith & Company stepped in, taking over Avalon Hill and saving the company. Their relationship to Avalon Hill was that J.E. Smith had designed all of the boxes for Avalon Hill games, while Monarch had printed all of them. Their acquisition of the company led to, as one would expect, a reorganization of the company itself. In fact, Thomas N. Shaw was the only staff member retained. The reorganization had a few other key components to it. The company relocated, cut costs, and got a brand new president, J.E. Sparling. Also in 1964, Avalon Hill had a release schedule for the first time, with the company promising 2 games per year. 1965 saw Avalon Hill come back with a vengeance. They released Blitzkrieg. Designed by Thomas N. Shaw and Larry Pinsky, it was a fictional representation of the breakout of World War II. It was also the game that set up the military simulation board game portion of the industry. Blitzkrieg came with a hard map board and printed cardboard square pieces. The map board was divided into hexes, with terrain for land, beaches, city, and the like printed on it. There were also provided charts, such as combat results, and a provided die for random outcomes. Blitzkrieg pieces represented large military units, such as brigades, divisions, squadrons, and air wings, representing infantry, airborne, rangers, armor, shock artillery, fighters, and bombers. Naval actions were allowed in the game, but it was pretty abstracted. In a smart move, Avalon Hill used the Hex division for its board, making it so that if a player learned this game, they could more easily learn other games. Overall, Blitzkrieg was a relatively new type of game. It was very novel and therefore very popular. Therefore, Avalon produced a number of rule variants, plus they published simulations of actual battles and campaigns based on this system, like Midway, Africa Corps, and the Battle of the Bulge. 1970 brought another war game to the Avalon Hill line, Panzer Blitz. Designed by Jim Dunnigan's Simulations Publications, Inc., was designed in a different way from other board-based battle games. Panzer Blitz was the first true board-based, tactical-level, commercially available conflict simulation, or in shorthand, war game. But wait, you're thinking, didn't we just talk about Blitzkrieg like 30 seconds ago? Yes, we did. The difference with Panzer Blitz is that, unlike Blitzkrieg, and other games of the type for that matter, the scale was more regimental or battalion rather than division size. In other words, Panzer Blitz was more of a one-on-one style of battle than previous games, which required players to better strategize. Now let me expand on that, because this is a point I want to make sure I make clear. Previous war board games were huge units versus each other, which would allow one unit or piece to attack another unit or piece and do a lot of damage without taking any damage themselves. With Panzer Blitz, this didn't work. If you tried a straight one-on-one, you would almost definitely lose a unit. So, strategy, such as combining units to attack, were required. Now, I know this kind of strategy was utilized before, but never quite on this level. Panzer Blitz has sold about 320,000 units in its lifetime, making it the most successful board war game in the history of the hobby. That led to dozens of expansions being published over the years, as fans of this game clamored for more. On November 30th, 1971, Monarch bought out J.E. Smith & Company, making Monarch the sole owner and causing the company to become a division of the renamed Monarch Office Systems, known as Monarch Avalon. In February 1976, Avalon Hill acquired several very successful games, including Acquire, Twix-T, and Feudal, after purchasing 3M Games. Acquire, which is still published today, is a multiplayer mergers and acquisitions board game, with the object of the game being to earn the most money by developing and merging hotel chains. Twix-T was an early entrant in 3M's bookshelf game series. Two players placed pegs and links on a game board, with the goal being to link the opposite sides of the pegs. Whoever had the most linked pegs won. Feudal was a chess-like board war game, with the goal being to either occupy the opponent's castle or to capture all of the opponent's royalty. What makes it different from chess is that up to 6 players could play at the same time. Oh, and Feudal is still being published today, if you're interested. Side note time. I mentioned the term bookshelf game a few minutes ago. 3M had a series of these in the 1960s and early 1970s. What made them bookshelf games was how they were packaged. Instead of the normal box, these games were packaged in large, hardback book sizes with a leatherette look. This meant they could be stored on a bookshelf like a normal hardcover book. Thus the name. Monarch Avalon continued the acquisitions in December of 1976, picking up the Sports Illustrated line of sports games. When combined with the 3M games, the number of retail outlets that would carry Avalon Hill games was increased immensely. And they didn't stop there. The Aladdin Industries game line was acquired by Monarch Avalon in March of 1977. Also, in May of 1977, the company started a sports game division, bringing Bruce Milligan aboard to lead that division, and he launched All-Star Replay Sport Game Magazine. During this time, Facts in 5, which had originally been a 3M game, became the company's top-selling game. Designed by Richard Onanian, the game went like this. 5 cards are drawn. Each card contains a class and a list of categories. A category is selected for each class and the players. Then 5 letter tiles are drawn. Then the players have 5 minutes to come up with an example that begins with each letter for each class or category. Facts in 5 is also still being published, just in case you're interested. Classic versions are available for purchase, used online. During the 1970s, Avalon Hill had a number of popular games they were publishing. In addition to the aforementioned Facts in 5 and Panzerblitz, they had Outdoor Survival, Squad Leader, and the Status Pro sports line. And as the decade continued, Avalon Hill purchased games from smaller companies, then republished them with great success. They acquired Heritage Models Battleline publications in October of 1979, which gave them access to Wooden Ships and Iron Men, Machiavelli, which was a diplomacy variant set in Renaissance Italy, and the original game, Diplomacy. Avalon also bought games from Jedco Games, the Russian Campaign and War at Sea, and they bought Civilization from Heartland Trefoil. 1830, which was developed and released by Avalon, had its basis in Francis Tresham's previous game, 1829. Needless to say, all of these games were successful for Avalon Hill, bringing them recognition and profit. However, not every decision Avalon Hill made during this period was successful, and one of them would come back to haunt them. In 1974, a couple of game developers pitched their new game to Avalon Hill. It was something new, a role-playing game, and it had a fantasy setting and a cooperative mechanism. Not understanding the concepts behind role-playing games, Avalon Hill rejected the proposal. As you may have figured out, the developers were Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson, and the game they pitched was Dungeons & Dragons. That rejection would come back to haunt them because, as we know by now, Gygax would form TSR to publish the game, and Dungeons & Dragons would be the premier game in the gaming market within 5 years. But of course, after realizing that role-playing games were the future of gaming, Avalon Hill got themselves into the game, releasing Powers and Perils in 1983 and Lords of Creation in 1984. Written by Richard Snyder, Powers and Perils was released as a box set containing 5 books, a pad of character sheets, and dice. The game itself was a very well-detailed fantasy system, utilizing skill-based character creation and a spell point magic system. The 5 books in the set were the Character Book, the Combat and Magic Book, the Creature Book, the Book of Human Encounters and Treasure, and a scenario, County Mordana. The game received another box set containing more world information, plus some expansions through Heroes magazine. However, the game was limited to this one and only edition. Now, why is that? Well, it was because Avalon Hill didn't understand the role-playing game market at the time. As one of the, if not the, top names in the strategy and wargaming field, their reputation for high-quality products, and the price tag that came with them, worked to their advantage. However, this backfired when they got into the role-playing game field, because with Powers and Perils running 2 to 3 times as much as D&D, and with D&D being far and away the market leader at this point, sales were always going to be poor. Because of this, as well as some controversy over drawings in the box set that were reported to be plagiarized, Powers and Perils was allowed to run out in 1984. Now, that's not to say that Avalon Hill just packed up and went away. They continued to work to take over the role-playing game portion of the industry, and worked out an agreement with Chaosium in 1983 to publish RuneQuest, White Bear, and Red Moon, which, by the way, they published as Dragon Pass, and Elric. However, none of these games got anywhere near to toppling the industry giant. So what then? Avalon Hill saw the future, and it was computer gaming. Starting in 1980, they had created a video game division, Microcomputer Games, and adapted quite a few of their board game titles to various computer platforms, utilizing data formats that few would remember today. You know, like the cassette tape for a computer, or the 5 1/4-inch disc. I'm old, I remember those. Anyway, they saw decent sales, but Octane Spitfire, released late in company history, was the one and only true hit. However, the computer game division did have 2 more moderate hits. Gulf Strike, released in 1983, was based on the Iran-Iraq War. It got an update after the war ended in a ceasefire in 1988. And the Dr. Ruth game in 1985, based on the show by Dr. Ruth Westheimer. If you don't know who that is, oh, you gotta Google it. Just say it. I'll wait. Okay, you're back. So as 1990 came around, the company was facing a serious economic swing. Avalon Hill had faced 3 straight years of losses, so Monarch Avalon did what most smart businesses do. They consolidated. The New York office closed, the toy division was sold, and inventory was reduced. They also published new content. In this case, it was Desert Shield, which was an expansion for Gulf Strike, which had also gotten a strategy board version. Desert Shield, based on the conflict of the same name, sold out within weeks of its October 1990 release and got a second printing in December of that year. By 1991, finances had gotten to the point that Hobbycraft Canada was sharing office space with Monarch Avalon. However, this didn't stop their attempts to right the ship. The AvalonCon World Board Gaming Championships were first held in 1991. It has since been renamed the World Board Gaming Championships and are held by the Board Game Players Association. During the convention, the 100 best attended games from the previous convention are played, with additional games added to the schedule by vote of BPA members. We'll talk more about all of this in detail when we talk about conventions in a future episode. In December of 1992, Avalon Hill hired Jim Rose to lead the computer game division. The idea was that since board game sales were down, the company's computer game division could pick up the slack and help boost their fortunes. And early on, it seemed to work. 1994 saw Avalon Hill re-enter the computer game market with Flight Commander 2. It was well reviewed, and it had decent sales. However, the overall return to computer games ultimately failed, with Terry Coleman of Computer Gaming World reporting in late 1998 that, quote, no Avalon Hill game in the past 5 years sold even 50,000 units worldwide, end quote. So, looking for something else, Avalon Hill added Pogs to its game lineup in 1995. You remember Pogs, right? The little flat milk cap looking tokens, the slammer you used to move them around, kids collecting the damn things by the dozens. Yeah? No? Maybe not? Well, Pogs as a game has been around for over 100 years, though it's known by many other names around the world. The trade name Pogs was a 1990s invention and led to a short revival in interest of the game. And by short, I mean really, really short. The entirety of this revival was about 3 years in the mid to late 1990s. Then, as kids do, it was off to the next fad. So with failure after failure shaking their usually solid foundation, and with Jim Rose leaving Avalon Hill to found his own company, Talonsoft, in 1995, Monarch Avalon placed Avalon Hill up for sale. However, this decision was shortly reversed. But that reprieve was short-lived. Monarch sold Avalon Hill to Hasbro on August 4th, 1998 for $6 million US. Then immediately, Hasbro laid off all of Avalon Hill's staff. Hasbro's plan for the brand was to take popular board games and convert them to computer games. With that in mind, Hasbro purchased the rights to the Avalon Hill trademarks, copyrights, inventory, tooling and divisions, Avalon Hill software, and Victory Games. These were then placed under the video game subsidiary, Hasbro Interactive. Avalon Hill Games Incorporated was incorporated by Hasbro on March 2nd, 1998. In 2001, Hasbro Interactive was sold to Infragames. However, Avalon Hill itself wasn't a part of that sale. Hasbro later transferred control of Avalon Hill to its subsidiary, Wizards of the Coast, in 2004. Hasbro has continued to release new titles under the Avalon Hill name, such as Star Wars, The Queen's Gambit in 2000. But also what they've done is to add the Avalon Hill imprint, which still carries a lot of weight, to older titles, like Axis and Allies, even though that's not an Avalon Hill original. On September 8th, 2020, Hasbro announced that it would be taking Avalon Hill management back under its own control, then made that official in January of 2021. Now, I mentioned Victory Games a few minutes ago when discussing the assets of Avalon Hill, so let's just talk a bit more about it. If you remember last week's episode, we discussed the biggest game Victory Games is known for, James Bond 007. Victory Games came about after Simulation Publications Incorporated was purchased by TSR in 1982. Avalon Hill hired away some of SPI's best and brightest and formed the subsidiary of Victory Games to produce their work. Critics loved their work, and so did the gaming public. During its heyday, Victory Games brought on developers like Leonard Quam, Kevin Boylan, and released games like Third Fleet and Carrier. Of course, the heyday only lasted until early 1991, when Quam left the company. Victory Games released 2 final titles, Flashpoint Golan and Across 5 Aprils, before Avalon decided to discontinue the brand. Avalon Hill produced 3 separate magazines during its run. The General magazine was a wide-reaching magazine, offering articles on play and tactic strategies for war games, historical analysis, sports and computer games, games by both Avalon Hill and their competitors. It really was a one-stop shop for the gamer. It ran from 1964 to 1998 and was discontinued after the purchase by Hasbro. All-Star Replay was Avalon's sports game magazine. 19 issues were published quarterly, later changing to bi-monthly from 1977 to 1981. In early 1984, Heroes, a role-playing magazine, came out, created specifically to support the four role-playing game lines Avalon Hill had at the time, which were RuneQuest, Powers and Perils, Lords of Creation, and James Bond 007. It ran for 10 issues from 1984 to 1986. And that brings our discussion of Avalon Hill to a close, though we might be discussing them just a little bit more later on down the line when we look at Wizards of the Coast in a longer form. Now, we're at 10 pages of script and about 3,500 words. Usually at this point in the podcast, I am looking for the appropriate point to wrap things up and head home. However, I promised you 2 game companies on today's tour, so let's keep it rolling with a look at Judges Guild. Judges Guild was founded on July 4th, 1976 by Bob Bledsaw and Bill Owen. The idea behind the company was to publish D&D material based on concepts from Bledsaw's home campaign. To that end, Bledsaw and Owen visited TSR in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin on July 17, 1976. Not only did they try to sway the company to publish some of their campaign materials, but also to publish Owens' rules for a game set during the American Civil War. Dave Arneson met with the pair, and he gave them verbal approval to produce supplemental materials for D&D, with the caveat that TSR had the right to review all materials before they were published. This deal was a win-win, as Judges Guild got the right to publish supplemental material for both D&D and AD&D, and TSR got supplemental material for the games, as they didn't have much, if any, at the time. In fact, TSR believed that nobody would be interested in supplemental materials. Yeah, lost that bet. As previously discussed, the first Judges Guild product to reach market, and in the minds of many, the best, was City State of the Invincible Overlord. I talked about that in great detail a couple of weeks ago, so I'll refer you back to it was our 1970s look at role-playing games. Owens left the company, and Judges Guild was ultimately incorporated in 1978. The company gained popularity at a rocket-style rate among D&D fans. This was due to the unprecedented detail in the product line, which was rare in the industry. At the company's peak in the early 1980s, Judges Guild employed 42 people and had over 250 products in print. However, as we all know, that which rockets up must eventually plummet quickly down. And this is what happened with Judges Guild. Even as the company was seeing historic success, they were experiencing a decrease in production values. Primarily, this was due to the fact that the rest of the industry was moving towards professional typesetting, full-color art, and slick and hard-covered materials. Judges Guild eventually adopted, but it was a really slow process. Another thing that led to the downward spiral was that Judges Guild products tended to be stuck in a 1970s mindset. What this meant was that a lot of puns, dungeon gauntlets, and isolated cities and howling wildernesses. That really differed from what started happening in the mid-1980s, which was a trend towards more realism in the gaming product. When it rains, it pours, and it poured for Judges Guild, as they lost their license to publish AD&D materials in 1982. In 1983, they published City State of Tarantus. When it came out to little notice and even fewer sales, the firm was shuttered in 1985. City State of the Invincible Overlord was repackaged and republished by Mayfair Games in 1987, but the changes to the game were not well received, and all of Judges Guild products were allowed to lay dormant. But Judges Guild was not fated to remain dead. In 1999, the company returned, selling new, revised copies of City State of the Invincible Overlord, reintroducing the role-playing game magazine Pegasus, though it only lasted for 2 issues, and producing new products for the D20 system. Now, other than announcing licensing agreements with other publishers for their work, Judges Guild tended to remain quiet for several years during this time. Bob Bledsaw died of cancer in 2008, and his son Bob II inherited the company. In 2011, Lost Man's Trail was published. This was the first original product produced by Judges Guild in over 25 years, and it was the last manuscript Bob Bledsaw worked on before he died. Designed to be either used with the Judges Guild Universal System, which I don't believe was ever printed, or with D&D, which obviously was, Lost Man's Trail was about a trail from the city of Modron to the coast, where adventurers have been known to disappear. The adventure earned decent reviews, but other than continuing to upgrade and reprint classic adventures, this is the last new publication by Judges Guild to this point. And with that, we come to the end of today's tour. Next week, we'll dive back into the timeline, picking up in 1985 and seeing just how far we can get. I also want to note that the following week, we're going to try to finish up that timeline, though I make you no promises. And 3 weeks from today, we're going to do something a little bit different for this podcast. I'm going to explain to you how you could start gaming if you've never gamed before and you're interested. I'm working on all 3 of those episodes right now, so time will tell how those work out. I need to thank the folks at BoardGameGeek.com for their assistance in my research this week due to the overwhelming number of out-of-print games I was looking into. Which reminds me, if you're looking for some out-of-print games, maybe try there. And as always, I need to shout you out for your continued support. Thanks to your listening every single week, we are slowly but surely building up a following. Which reminds me, you can follow Role-Playing History Podcast on Facebook and Instagram, and you can hit us up on Twitter at Role-Playing History Podcast. We also have an email account, roleplayinghistorypodcast@gmail.com, where you can send us questions or show ideas. Still working on getting iTunes and Audible on our distribution list, and I'm still working on that webpage, but I'll let you know when we get them there. Next Friday, 10 a.m. U.S. Central Time, we will cover the history of role-playing games from 1985 until we run out of steam. But that's next week. Again, thanks for listening. I'm Wayne Davis, and you're Role-Playing History.